Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Senior Vice President for Climate and Energy at Third Way, Josh Freed.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you. We can do a little better than that. We've done a fantastic event. So good morning, everyone. Excellent. Thank you so much. On behalf of Third Way, welcome, and thank you for joining us here at Hamilton Live for this very exciting event. We chose this location not only because it's really cool, but because of its namesake, Alexander Hamilton. 230 years ago, the then Secretary of Treasury submitted to the House of Representatives a report on manufacturers. At the time, many of our leaders of the fledgling country wanted a very limited government and a rural, agrarian-based economy. Hamilton saw things differently. The federal government, he argued, had an important role to play in shaping the United States economy. In 1791, he saw manufacturing as critical to building a strong American economy, to creating new jobs, and protecting our security. And the only way to accomplish this, he believed, was if the federal government took action, worked with business, and invested in emerging industries. How right Alexander Hamilton was. The Intercontinental Railroad, civil aviation, heavy industry, information technology and telecommunications. In every instance, action from the government partnering with workers and the private sector spurred technology revolutions that transformed the United States and the world. And we are here today to look ahead at the next revolution in clean energy and the role for the United States of America. For when America leads in inventing, in making, and in deploying technology, the world benefits. In this case, it's about accelerating the global transformation to an economy run by affordable, reliable, secure, and clean energy. This is an opportunity that is driven home by a groundbreaking report by Boston Consulting Group that Third Way and Breakthrough Energy commissioned. Now, you'll hear a lot more throughout this event about the report, but there are 3 points that we hope you take home with you today. First, over the next 30 years, the clean energy market is going to grow to enormous proportions. Second, if we act fast and we act wisely, the United States can compete for and lead in the emerging clean energy economy. And third, when the United States leads, the world benefits. Let's explore the first point, growth of the clean energy markets. Now, the headlines of the last 6 months, Russia's use of fossil energy as a weapon in its illegal war against Ukraine, skyrocketing energy prices, and climate-caused crises that span the globe show unequivocally why there is an urgent need for clean energy now. But much of our country hasn't grasped exactly how transformational the market will be. This is why we commissioned the study. It estimates just in the 6 key technologies that we examined, clean steel, direct air capture, electric vehicles, low carbon hydrogen, advanced nuclear, and long duration storage, there will be a market of $3 trillion a year. That's more than 10% of US GDP for just those 6 technologies. So how can the US move quickly and capture these opportunities? This is where the Inflation Reduction Act, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, and the CHIPS Act come in. Thanks to the leadership of President Joe Biden and cabinet secretaries like Jennifer Granholm, the United States government now has more than $500 billion in investments and incentives to partner with the private sector and with workers and help America lead in inventing, making, building, and exporting clean energy. And the report provides a playbook on exactly where U.S. workers and companies
guided by smart government policy and investment, can lead by focusing on parts of the value chain where we have competitive advantages. If we follow this plan, the U.S. could generate more than $340 billion in exports annually. That is $100 billion more than the value of all of our current fossil fuel exports. And finally, on U.S. leadership. We are a country of innovators, of change makers, and creative minds. From the time of Hamilton up through the end of the Cold War in the 1980s, the United States and democracies grew, sometimes with fits and starts, in part because the government and the private sector worked together. This stumbled in the era of globalization. The promised market expansion, more equitable distribution of technology, economic growth and rights, and a coordinated response to climate change were not met. Those of us here today recognize that globalization has reached its limits. Our multipolar world appears to be moving in a bipolar direction, with democracies on one side and authoritarian states on the other. And those democracies are looking to the United States for secure, clean energy and climate action. The United States is not preordained to lead. Our success is not from luck or from destiny. It happens when the public sector sets a course and partners with labor and the private sector to get there together. We are once again at a point where this can and must happen. President Biden, Secretary Granholm, and this entire administration not only understand this in their bones, they are acting on it. Because of what the administration and Congress have done over the last 2 years, we are now in a position to seize the opportunity laid out in our research with Boston Consulting Group. With the investments made and catalyzed by the trifecta of laws and the ingenuity and scale of American industry, the United States can transform clean energy as we have other sectors throughout our history, and we can share the economic, security, and climate benefits with the world. And we can think of no better person to speak on this issue than U.S. Secretary of Energy Jennifer Granholm. Secretary of Energy Granholm is an outspoken leader on American manufacturing, on workers, and the transition to clean energy. And she'll be leading our first conversation, which will also include CEO of Air Products, Seifi Ghasemi, and ESS CEO Erica Dresselhaus, and the International Vice President for U.S. Steelworkers, Roxanne Brown. In this age of social media, I'd like to also ask you if you could post your favorite moments, quotes, or pictures from this event on Twitter or LinkedIn. We're using the hashtag #WhenAmericaLeads, and we'd really appreciate that. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Secretary Granholm.
Thank you so much, Josh. Super smart comments. Hi, everybody. Thanks for being here. First of all, thanks to Third Way for organizing, and thanks to the partners in the report that's about to be issued, Boston Consulting Group and Breakthrough. Really appreciate the smart way it has been analyzed, the 6 sectors, all of that, completely dovetailing with what the administration is doing and intends to do. So let me just start with this. On our way last week, I think I'm sitting over here, on our way this week to the IRA celebration at the White House, I was thinking about a visit that I made with Securing America's Future Energy, SAFE, to China about a decade ago. It was just after I was governor of Michigan. And we went to look at what China was doing in their strategy on energy policy. And we went to a number, we met with a number of mayors from a couple of provinces, and they had a demonstration of the technologies that they were investing in and the strategies they were using. Super fascinating. And as one of the demonstrations was happening, I was standing next to one of the mayors, and he leans over to me and he says, "So, when do you think the United States is going to get federal energy policy. And I said, oh, I don't know. Congress is so divided. It's going to be really hard. States may be acting, but it's, it's very disconnected. And he said to me, he got this big smile, and he said, take your time. Take your time, because, of course, our passivity has been other countries' opportunity. And so I, as governor of Michigan, when I was governor of Michigan, we saw so many jobs and factories leave because of globalization, and we did not have a strategy. And so now we have a president who understands the importance of creating opportunity out of this clean energy sector in the United States, that we are not going to stand by and watch, the more thousands of factories go overseas, because we are going to level the playing field. We're going to make it competitive to be able to build stuff in this growing sector in the United States. No more are we going to be bystanders. No more are we going to bring a knife to a gunfight. Right? So the president's strategy, right? This three-pronged strategy that Josh described, in addition to a bunch of other stuff, of course, the administration is doing. But these are the three that I consider the most important body of work. And when I say body, I mean the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, just 11 months ago. That is sort of the backbone. The backbone because it is focused on place-based hubs, technologies that are next-generation technologies, huge opportunity to breathe life into areas of the country that may have been disproportionately negatively affected by either trade policy or lack of strategy on the ground, or by pollution, fence-line communities, front-line communities, and hubs for technology that get the private sector engaged in this next generation of clean energy technologies. For example, next generation clean hydrogen, advanced nuclear reactors, making sure that we're doing the right thing by focusing on direct air capture and carbon capture and all of the technologies that y'all have been looking at through the report that's going to be issued today. Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, backbone. The brains, of course, is the CHIPS Act. And when I say that, obviously, technologies, chips and science, right? So the technology associated with supply chains, we cannot just see that either. And so being able to, I was just over the week on Monday in Idaho for the groundbreaking of Micron's $15 billion semiconductor facility. And that's one of the whole series of announcements that have been made as a result of the passage of the CHIPS and Science Act. We at the Department of Energy, on the science side, we're looking at this next generation series of technologies as well, and we're announcing a whole series of earth shots, we call them, that are, reach goals on reducing the costs for technologies that will make them globally competitive and competitive with traditional sources of energy. Today we're announcing an earth shot related to offshore floating wind platforms, floating wind, so that we can reduce the cost of that by 70% to $45 a megawatt hour. But all of these earth shots, we have an earth shot on clean hydrogen, we have an earth shot on direct air capture, we announced last week an earth shot on enhanced geothermal systems, the heat beneath our feet. We have announced an earth shot on long duration energy storage. That's the chips and science, and the investment in science is the second piece of the strategy in the Biden administration. And the third piece, of course, is the heart and lungs, which is the Inflation Reduction Act. And that is going to really get the private sector off the sidelines by leveling the playing field and making us competitive to be able to secure these jobs in America. I'm super excited to be able to have this conversation with three people who are absolutely bring an important perspective because they're all working in this space. I will say this, that it is important for us to be strategic. I mean, none of these bills happen by happenstance. As you know, if you've read anything about the Inflation Reduction Act, it has a whole series of strategies in there, like the strategy to incentivize onshoring, because there's content provisions to be able to access these tax credits. The strategy about lifting wages gets you additional points in your tax credits if you pay prevailing wage, if you have apprenticeships. The strategy of making sure that we do right by communities that have been on the front lines, disadvantaged communities, gets you extra points if you locate your technology or your manufacturing opportunity in those communities, or certainly consult with them in a meaningful way. So there's all sorts of strategy that happens. But the strategy we also need is this global strategy. Where can we have a comparative advantage as a country? And if we don't have that comparative advantage, even with these bills, what can we do to gain an advantage? Where does it make sense for us to partner globally with allies that we can have some assurances will have our back in tough times, but may also be able to provide some inputs that we don't have right away? So there's all sorts of global competitiveness considerations that we've got to consider. So let me invite my panelists out here, Seifi Gassami and Roxanne Brown, and where are we? And Eric Dresselhaus. Come on out, because we're going to have a discussion about this very thing. Thank you. Seifi is the CEO of Air Products, based in Pennsylvania. Roxanne Brown, the Vice President at Large for the US Steelworkers. Love that. Eric Dresselhaus is the CEO of ESS, which is an innovative long-duration storage company based in Oregon. Have a seat.
All right. Thank you.
All right. So I am going to ask you guys a series of questions. I know somebody's going to flag me, right, if we go over. All right. So I'm going to start with you all, and I'd love to just get a quick take from you to start about how, in the respective areas that you are in, how the U.S. can be winning the market in your areas, and what do we still need to do to make it competitive? So maybe we'll just go down the line in this direction.
Sure, thank you. Air Products, as most of the people know, we are the largest producer of hydrogen. And 8 years ago, we decided that we would be the leader in blue hydrogen and green hydrogen, which are the energy sources of the future. And we looked around the world, and we started some projects in different parts of the world. But what you and the Biden administration were able to accomplish with the IRA is clearly going to give us an advantage to do these projects in the United States and make the United States competitive. And we are doing a huge project in, for example, Saudi Arabia, because that's where there is a lot of sun and wind and all of that. But I think with the legislation, you have made it possible for us to be competitive. And as a result of that, Madam Secretary, I can commit Air Products that we will, in the next 5 years or 6 years, invest $15 billion in the United States to produce
That's what I'm talking about.
And green hydrogen.
$15 billion for clean hydrogen.
Yeah.
Jobs.
Yeah.
Love it. That's awesome. Thank you. From your perspective with the U.S. Steelworkers, give us a view.
Thank you, Madam Secretary, and thank you so much for this wonderful panel. It's an honor to be here with you today. You know, for those of you who don't know the steelworkers, we are, as I like to say, the union of everything. And when you think about the domestic clean energy supply chain, that's my members. They are literally in every single basic industry that you can possibly think of. Steelworkers is the name that is out there. We have a long name that many of us do not remember, but it's steel, aluminum, glass, rubber, chemicals, refining. We are a very diverse union, and we win the market by making sure that all of those sectors has a future in this country. And a lot of that comes from what has been done through the infrastructure bill, through the Inflation Reduction Act, but a lot of it rests on trade policy. And what we've seen in those industries countless times over and over the last 30, 40 years really is trade policy that has failed them. And instead of having stories of victory, we have so many stories of loss. Hopefully until now. The Biden-Harris administration has really presented a pathway for potential success for the domestic clean energy supply chain. I'm going to say it 10 million times while I'm here, because I want to really emphasize how important that is to winning the market. We don't win clean tech without making the stuff that goes into clean tech.
I love it.
Thank you.
I love it when I was governor of Michigan, because we lost so many jobs as a result of unfettered global free trade. I used to campaign, and I know this is probably not popular, but maybe it's getting more popular. Anyway, I used to say, NAFTA and CAFTA have given us the shafta. And
Yeah.
it's true, because we didn't pay attention to the consequences on the ground of real people whose lives have been upended from, we want trade, obviously. I'm not saying that, but it's got to be fair.
That's right.
And we've got to help our businesses have a level playing field, which is what the Inflation Reduction Act starts to do.
Absolutely.
Perfect setup, because in the world of energy storage, when you talk about the competition globally, the answer is pretty simple. It's China.
Yeah.
China has made a huge commitment at a national level to dominate this space, going down to the mining and kind of raw material range on up through the processing and the development. So the energy storage market today equals China, and that comes in part by third-party estimates for something like a $60 billion state investment that China has made over the last decade or so.
Right.
The good news is, as the market keeps evolving and the needs change, now we're moving from kind of the technologies we've needed in the past to bigger scale, longer duration storage technologies. And that opens the window for US companies to step up and bring more of a technical innovation approach to win that game. So with the infrastructure bill, with the IRA bill coming on now, it's been a shot of adrenaline into, can we do it, can we build it here? And I'll say technologically leapfrog the old approach, because I don't think we're going to outmine China. At this point, I think that's a tougher path, but we can out-innovate our foreign competitors and build better products that are more applicable to the needs we have.
Did you say we can't outmine?
Yeah.
So it's an interesting point in the discussion, because, of course, there are incentives in the Inflation Reduction Act for sustainable mining, which, sustainable mining requires regulatory practices that make something more expensive. Recognize that. But in this, Josh referred to this new global order. And in this new global order, one wonders if there isn't a comparative advantage to doing sustainable mining in a new global order where other countries are looking at, and businesses certainly, are looking at their own ESG requirements. If there isn't a comparative advantage for us to really look at what our sustainable mining practices are. I mean, you Seifi, were headed a company that did lithium. Was it mining or processing, or what was?
It was both.
It was both.
We had the mining in Nevada, and we had the processing in the US, and also in Chile, and then in China.
And so the issue for us as a country is, how can we do it sustainably? And because it takes a while, right, to get a mine going, and we've got all of these deadlines, can we do something more quickly with allies who we trust and who share our values to be able to do that? So I think of Canada, of course, does an awful lot of responsible mining. Mexico has huge opportunities and does some, obviously Australia as well. So, there are patches of allies that we should be looking at filling in gaps for, even as we're building out our own strategy to get to the quick stuff. I'm curious about hydrogen, though, because obviously you guys do so much in hydrogen. What makes, Air Products is competitive, obviously. What would make you more competitive? What else do we need to do in the United States to really build this up and have a comparative advantage with our allies, although we want our allies to build up their own hydrogen capabilities as well? Say a word about the comparative advantage.
Well, I think right now, the first thing is that I'm very happy about is that at the highest level, you and the president have recognized that hydrogen is the future. I mean, that was the first step. Then you have taken steps to put in the incentives for us to produce, which we will, and it will be competitive. Now I think it's time to focus on developing the demand, because with us building all of these facilities, if there is no demand, then it's not going to be successful. So encouraging the demand is going to be, I think, the next step. There are some provisions in the IRA Act, but I think we need to go one step further, that if people are driving trucks or running industries, steel plants, chemicals, which are putting a significant amount of CO2 into the air, and they can use the technology that we have as a best available technology to reduce those emissions, that they will be encouraged to do that. So creating the demand is really the next step, and encouraging people. Now, I obviously personally believe the best way to do that is to have a carbon tax, global carbon tax, but I know how difficult it is politically and all of that. But short of that, right now, when I look at the US, I think California has done a lot of good things with the low carbon LCFS program that they have to encourage the use of green energy. So I think the rest of if we can take that program and kind of make it like a federal program, that will go a long way then it will help us, because the more we produce, the more competitive we become.
Right, and it's interesting because the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law gave us $8 billion to establish hydrogen hubs across the country to help reduce the cost, but that doesn't, and that will help with demand, right? We have to prove it out. I think people need to feel comfortable with it. But I will say, too, that, the president didn't get everything he wanted in his agenda. It was a product of compromise. So there is an opportunity to continue to perfect our strategy going forward and work on the demand side a little bit. He's not so big on the carbon tax, but there are other ways to do clean energy standards, for example. Super exciting. Now, I'm going to start with you, Roxanne, but I want everybody's answer on this. What do you think are the provisions of either of the three pieces of the agenda that are going to be most impactful for you all?
So I'll hit on two. The first, I would say, from the infrastructure bill is one that's really important, is the $65 billion that goes towards broadband. We have hundreds of workers who work at Corning in Wilmington, North Carolina, who make fiber optic cables. That money is a huge infusion of resources for that facility to be able to help build out the broadband right across this country, and to build and to bring broadband into communities of color and others that really, really need it. Steelworker jobs are directly connected to that because of that $65 billion, and that means something. That's something tangible that workers, all of us are in the policy world, right? This is a policy conversation. But for workers, we need to kind of drill down what it is that we're talking about here. And so when I go to my members and I talk about this, that's what I say. That's $65 billion. That means something to you, and this is how. The other thing that really means something to our members, and it's something that we worked really hard to fight for years, since 2005, since the PTC and ITCs, is to have that bonus credit for domestic content that's in the IRA. Yeah. I cannot emphasize how huge that is. And it's something, to be honest, that we fought with the clean tech sector about as we were working through the IRA. But we refused to let up. We're here for deploy. We want to deploy clean tech. But as we deploy, we can also, again, grow that clean energy supply chain. And including that domestic bonus credit for domestic content will help to grow that supply chain. And as we deploy, we grow the domestic industries to support this. We can walk and chew gum at the same time. And so, that is something that, again, I can go to Toledo, Ohio, at our members at Cleveland Cliffs. I could go to McWane Ductile Iron Pipe in Texas and show our members, this means your jobs. And that's what's really critical to working people.
Yeah, I'd say that if you look across IRA and the Infrastructure Act, it addresses a little bit what Safi was just talking about. In the world of grid and energy storage, there are bottoms-up manufacturing, domestic manufacturing incentives, but they are connected to demand-generating incentives as well. So a couple of things to call out. There are Things like a standalone investment tax credit with the domestic kicker is a great example. People, utilities, cities, communities, developers who want to develop renewable projects can now implement energy storage and qualify for a tax credit. It's a bigger tax credit with domestic manufacturing. Then you combine that with things like the advanced manufacturing production tax credit, and that says, hey, if you build it here in the US, it's going to be worth a lot more too. So it really ties those two knots together. And then if you look at the infrastructure bill, there's a number of buckets of money for grid resiliency, smart grid improvements and things, and that's going to help create project pull out from the communities across the country. So it's really the combination. Any one of those would have been great. We would have said thank you very much. But it's the combination of those three things together that really supercharges the whole effort. And I think the big, for an electricity kind of focused person, the next big question is going to be, what do the states do? Because we have, this is probably the single most important national initiative that's ever been put out for clean energy. But in our country, it's a state level initiative to deploy. So we need the state public utility commissions, the governors, to say, wait a minute, now's the time to go act and push specific projects out into the field.
From the specific area that we are focused on, I think all of the IRA Act and the infrastructure, they're all impactful. But the most impactful is going to end up to be, from our point of view, the extension of the 45Q to $85. That is going to create significant incentive to produce blue hydrogen, which would be the cheapest form of low carbon hydrogen. And it is in great demand both domestically and for export. The second one was the $3 per kilogram for green hydrogen. That is going to generate significant amount of investment, as I mentioned, on our side, and I'm sure other people, to produce green hydrogen in the United States. And then the third one was the incentive that you put in on sustainable airline fuel is very important because as we transforming the trucks, the trains, the ships to hydrogen, fine. But the planes is going to be 15 years away. But the sustainable airline fuel is going to help reduce the carbon content right now because that is a total replacement for diesel. And that $1.25 that you put in there will have a significant effect. We are building a plant to produce sustainable airline fuel in Los Angeles. It will produce 20,000 barrels a day, which is 350 million gallons. $1.25 is a lot of money to support that project. So I think all of the things that you have done, I'm really excited about the fact that the title of this thing is America Taking the Lead. I was in Germany last week talking to the ministers there, and I was telling them, you know, the world expected that Europe will be ahead of that, and I'm so proud as an American that our country made the first step. And believe me, that is going to significantly put the U.S. ahead of everybody else.
Well, yes, right? We're hosting with Carnegie Mellon next week a big conference in Pittsburgh, the Global Clean Energy Leadership Action Forum. And we've got 30 ministers coming to it and a whole bunch of private sector, over 6,000 people coming. But they're all super interested in the very technologies that we're talking about here, because every minister, as we're seeing with the war, I mean, everybody wants to be able to make their country secure. But the United States is now, can hold its head high going into this conference, going into COP, to say that we are really, we are leading. And we want and just, I'm going to get to you, Eric, because I want to ask you about supply chains related to your company and what you're seeing. But the other thing I think that's super important, even though it's not codified, the president has a goal of getting to 100% clean electricity by 2035. And we are organizing our deployment efforts around that. And pushing the utilities, pushing from the leadership position that the president has. We have to add 2,000 gigawatts of clean energy to the electric grid, in addition to building out the capacity of the electric grid. So all of this has to happen at the same time. And of course, long duration storage is a huge piece of that, Eric. And so you have such a unique supply chain, because your product it's huge, and you have different kinds of supply chain that people may not think about. Say a word about what you see as how can we make it more competitive for you to have content from the United States, and what you're seeing overall?
Yeah, we build our batteries in the US, but we are trying to have as domestic, our goal is 100% friendshored, which means either domestic or with trusted partners from overseas. We're at about 87% domestic content today. One of the things we talk about bringing jobs back to the U.S., and the bill does just a ton of great things for that. But it's not just about me and the folks in my factory, it's all of the downstream supply chain. So we're building these industries kind of bottom up to get there. The good news is the ingredients that I need are all things that I can get here. They're all possible to get in America. I don't have a mineral or a rare earth or something that I know I have to get somewhere else. But we have to build up the supply chains to do this, to your point, at scale, because whatever I'm doing today, I've got to do it 1,000 times bigger in a couple of years. And so that's not just me, it's bringing the whole supply chain. And I think the trickle-through economic value, the trickle-through job creation is going to be immense. It's probably going to, we're trying to track it, but I bet you it'll touch all 50 states.
And you're one company. This trickle through is huge, and it means huge amount for workers. Roxanne, talk about, often before this series of bills, companies chase low wages.
Yeah.
And even though our workers were the most skilled, and we have unions that are training people to be utterly skilled, talk now about whether you think we have a skills advantage, even though it may be a little more expensive labor-wise, but that we can use that skills advantage to be able to attract investment and grow investment here.
Absolutely. We without question have a skills advantage. I think any labor person that you talk to in the United States would say that we have the best and brightest and most committed workforce, especially to help grow this economy. And I would just say, just broadly in terms of the clean energy economy, when we talk about it in our union, we liken it to the onset of the Industrial Revolution, where the American worker was essential to the Industrial Revolution. The American worker is essential to the clean energy technology revolution, full stop. And to your point about wages, just like those jobs during the Industrial Revolution were good jobs, they were good union jobs. We want to make sure that these clean tech jobs are also good union jobs. That's how you attract a skilled workforce. You can't pay, the steelworker event, can't pay wages and expect to get the workforce of the future. Folks need to raise a family, right? And so as we're deploying these technologies, as industries are growing, we want to make sure that the American worker also comes along with it. And I'll just use this example that we're really proud of, and it's a good example of what can happen when labor and industry work together. US Wind has developed a facility in Baltimore called Sparrows Point Steel, and it's on the ground of the former Bethlehem Steel facility, which during its heyday was called the Beast of the East. There were 30,000 steelworker men and women who worked at that facility, and it was essential to the country. That facility shut down in 2012, and with it went all Basic Steel in Maryland. Now with this Sparrows Point Steel facility, because of this labor management partnership between us and US Wind, steel is coming back to Maryland, and those jobs will be steelworker jobs, and there will be 600 jobs at that facility making monopiles for
That's
offshore
great.
wind.
That's so great.
That is the story.
Yeah,
Thank you.
It is
Yes.
so great. It is so great.
For us, That's the story, and that's the promise of what we can see with the clean energy economy.
I love that. It gave me goosebumps. We have 2 minutes, and I'm going to ask all three of you. So you got to give me like a boom answer. Okay. So the report that is being issued today talks about the opportunity for exporting, for us building here, exporting to largely Asia and Europe, and those are big opportunities. If you had to give like one piece of advice about what we should be doing to capitalize on that, from your perspective, what would it be? Quick.
Permitting.
Permitting.
Yeah.
Oh, well, that's
For
something
facility.
that's on tap. Okay.
Training, job training.
Job training.
I'd say by deploying it here and demonstrating all of these technologies, countries around the world want to work, they want to buy American. We've forgotten that. We are trusted partners, we obey the law, we fulfill our contracts. People want to work with American companies. Our little company in Portland is already shipping product to Europe, already shipping product to Australia, already shipping product to Asia. People want to buy products made in America.
And you heard it here. We agree. Super excited about the future. Super excited to do it well, to plan and do it well, but to also do it with an enormous amount of urgency. We have 581 days left in this administration. Those are working days, not weekends. Working days left in this administration that we know of, right? That till the first term is over. And I have a board next to my desk where I change the number every single day to what we have left, so that urgency is always top of mind. But strategy is really important to do it right and to build it out right. And I think we've done a great job in the administration in doing that. The president has been really clearly focused on creating economic opportunity here, being able to lead the world, be able to build stuff here and export it elsewhere. And we are super excited to get to work. So thank you so much to Third Way. Thank you to the Boston Consulting Group. Thank you to Breakthrough Energy. And thank you to these great panelists. Give them a hand. Thank you.
Thank you.
Next.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Managing Director and Partner at Boston Consulting Group, Tina Zuzak-Arden. Managing Director and Senior Advisor for Clean Energy and Innovation to U.S. Special Presidential Envoy for Climate John Kerry at the U.S. State Department, Varun Sivaram. Senior Resident Fellow and Economist at Third Way, Ellen Hughes Cromwick. Executive Vice President of Breakthrough Energy, Mike Boots. And our conversation moderator, reporter with The Atlantic, Robinson Meyer.
Thanks so much for having us. You know, it's always daunting when you follow, as a journalist, you follow the Secretary of Energy, and then she takes so many of the questions, she asks so many of the same questions you were planning on asking. It's a great privilege and a great experience. Thank you all for being here today. I want to get right into it. You know, it was so great to hear Josh describe this as almost a peer to the Hamilton Report on Manufacturers, because I recently read the Hamilton Report on Manufacturers, or at least skimmed it, and was struck, and reading this report recently, I was like, oh, they are actually quite similar. They really do go through all the industries. I mean, it is worth looking at these two documents, because this report, like the last one, like the Hamilton Report, does go through the industries and talk about these challenges. And as a journalist who's been covering this issue for a little while, you often hear people kind of make these allusions to why certain industries might be challenging, or different specificities unique to each industry, that why they won't just respond to the kind of standard economic incentives. And it was wonderful to see them all brought together in this report. And so I want to start by asking Tina, what, in your view, as an author, I mean, as someone who worked on this report, makes this study distinctive?
So, I mean, the study is kind of interesting. People ask me what surprised me about it, too. And I think what came out of this study is really that there is so much more opportunity than I thought that there was here for America. And I think the reason we were able to actually find some of that, so for those of you who don't know, we looked at 6 of these emerging technologies, so clean steel, electric vehicles, long duration energy storage, direct air capture, green hydrogen. We looked at a bunch of things that, you know, Hamilton could not have dreamed of when he wrote his report. But what we did is, instead of looking at them monolithically, we broke them down into their value chains. And I think that's what's one of the things that's really different here. It's easy to say when you look at electric vehicles, you say, well, we don't have, you know, a specific, you know, rare earth material that puts us at a competitive disadvantage. Or, you know, SMR nuclear, we don't have uranium here. What does that mean for our competitiveness? But by breaking it down and saying everything from, you know, yes, raw materials, but also to OEM, to aftermarket sales, to all of these different elements, we were really able to see where are those parts of the value chain where the United States can be truly competitive in the long term. So I think that's one part.
And I just want to make sure I understand, this report was mostly written before the IRA, is that right?
Yeah, so, you know, I'd say everything that, you know, we have in here, you know, I would just turbocharge it for what we said. Everything that we thought could be possible is now absolutely doable, which is incredibly exciting. And you'll see some of the numbers in here, like $330 billion in potential exports, which dwarfs what we are currently doing on fossil fuels. $60 trillion in an addressable market for the United States. I only have hopes that this is bigger now going forward for the United States.
Was there a particular industry that particularly surprised you, I guess?
Well, I'd say there's a couple things. You know, one, I mean, I guess EVs dwarf everything else that we're looking at, which I guess wasn't truly surprising, but the magnitude of it was pretty significant. Where SMR nuclear was one of those that actually was interesting, and this comes back to that value chain perspective, where again you say, okay, we don't have uranium, so this isn't going to be where we are competitive. It actually, when we looked at the raw materials question, it was like, okay, we may not be mining it, you know, here in a way that Russia can, but what we can do is actually set up a domestic industry that can process this and actually turn this into something usable. And that was interesting to us to see when you actually break it down at that level.
I want to get back to this raw material value chain question in a second. First, I want to go to Ellen and ask, how did you think about competitiveness in the study across the board? I mean, is this competition with China? Is this, how do we even define economic competitiveness? Because it feels like one of those traits that everyone aspires to, but is quite amorphous when you actually get down to it.
Yeah, Rob, I want to dovetail what Tina just said in terms of the study's approach, looking at the value chains or supply chains from raw materials out to services, all along that spectrum. What an incredible feat to really build an evidence base on that. And then this point about competitiveness. BCG didn't just take one indicator of competitiveness. I'm sure you've all read studies, the number of patents as the single point of entry in understanding competitiveness. They really looked across 7 different indicators and examined where are those thresholds in terms of these indicators that then will give us some understanding about where our companies are either competitive today or have that potential for competitiveness. And then just one further step, which is not just to look at those indicators, but then to say, is this a durable competitive advantage? That's really important because oftentimes, you know, we see in capital markets and the corporate sector where, you know, they're great for a quarter or they're great for the year, but then it's a one and done. In this study, what they really gave us and you, I hope you really kind of access our website now that it's made available to you, they really didn't just stop there, but say, is this something that can last for a while? And I think, Rob, we're going to get into this discussion of how the policy that is in the troika of legislation that the secretary just talked about, it's not a one and done policy. It isn't a tax credit that's going to expire in a year. It's there for 10 years, and that's what companies need to accelerate their growth.
Can I ask, you have provided me a wonderful transition that I'm now going to completely ignore just to get, just to get an example. When we talk about, what's an example of the durable competitive advantage that you mentioned? How do we even know the difference between, because the market's very intelligent and is able to push, this is supposedly what it does. It does erode competitive advantage over time. So what might give the U.S. a durable competitive advantage?
Yeah, let me mention a couple. Having come from the auto sector, I know how important it is for competitiveness to achieve low operational cost. And, oftentimes when economists go out and measure competitiveness, they're not really thinking about that so much. So low operational cost means that a company in an industry can begin to scale up to maximum volume. And why is that so important? Because if you can't lower your operational costs and get to maximum volume, you can't sell into a market at a competitive level. So low operational cost is critical. The second one, there's 7 in there, so please take a look at all 7. But the second one that I think is really critical is the measurement of innovation and intellectual property. That whole area is absolutely critical. So every company out there in the clean tech sector isn't just looking at, hey, what do I have today? But it's doing research and innovating to figure out how can I then be ahead of everybody else in 5 years. So nobody's standing still. They're looking at where am I going to be in 5 years or so. So it's that kind of sustainable feature of competitiveness that really is rock solid around intellectual property and innovation.
Thank you. Mike, now I'm going to take this transition that you wonderfully gave me. Can you give us a quick sense of how the IRA and the troika of bills, I like that term, changed how companies are approaching this as you've interacted with them? What tools matter the most that were recently passed that are now in the law?
Sure. The panel before us, I think, talked pretty well about how you translate broad abstract policy changes into, to Ellen's point, operational decisions that they're making and capital decisions that they're making every day. It really is, across all 3 of these bills, a game changer from where we were before. You have, through the CHIPS Act, a real commitment to enduring R&D investments in a way that breed that innovation that Ellen was just talking about. You have, through the infrastructure bill, really unprecedented investments for this country in the enabling infrastructure, whether that's transmission or hydrogen or DAC infrastructure, in a way that just we weren't putting in those dollars. And these are high CapEx industries that need that infusion of enabling infrastructure. And then really through the IRA, we are driving down the costs, both operational and technology and engineering costs, that come from building these projects and building companies that can compete in those markets. And so through the reliable tax credits that, frankly, industry has been required over the last 10 or so years to think about the tax credits from Washington in a 1-year, 2-year cycle at best, right? Sometimes it's even less than that. And so the idea that that's going to motivate their investors to put more money in a durable way, it's just not the case. And so pairing that R&D, enabling infrastructure, and long-term tax credit that can start to reduce those green premiums in a way is just a real game changer.
Thank you. Varun, now we're going to bring everyone in after this. Questions, you should feel free to interrupt each other. Everyone will have now spoken. Varun, I understand that this, or you were telling me at least, that this study emerged apart from a beer you had with Josh. So what's next? And what are the administration and, the U.S. government going to do to follow up on some of the opportunities here?
Thanks, Rob. This did actually come out of a beer with Josh, wherever he is. Look, early on in the administration, American clean tech competitiveness was a priority. Secretary Raimondo, our Commerce Secretary, convened the principals, Secretary Granholm, my boss, Secretary John Kerry, to talk about the importance. And everybody was very much on board. And I'll talk for a moment about why it is so important. But one clear thing that we do that we needed and that we still continue to need going forward is strong analytical backing for where the opportunities are, which is why this study was so important. I was grateful to Josh and to Breakthrough. They stepped forward so quickly to put this analysis together, and to BCG, which has been our partner along multiple fronts, the First Movers Coalition, for example. Wonderful work. This study shows us things that we kind of knew at a high level and an abstract, that there was a multi-billion, possibly multi-trillion-dollar opportunity in clean technologies at home and abroad. That if you graphed on the x-axis America's durable competitive advantage, and on the y-axis the size of the market, you would find some technologies that were in the sweet spot for both. Electric vehicles, as it turns out from this report, turn out to be one of those sweet spot areas where we can win. It turns out that this study shows that there are some new technology areas that aren't yet dominated by one country, where the United States really stands a chance of getting into that market, competing, and in many cases capturing, seizing a large market share. Why is this all so important? I can think of three reasons at least that we often don't talk about. The first is when the United States invests in these emerging technologies, gains expertise and wins market share, we drive down the cost of those technologies for global deployment. Look, 95% of future emissions between now and 2100 will come from outside of these borders. No matter what we do to reduce emissions at home, we also need to do something to reduce that 95% problem abroad. And that's what us driving down technology costs can do. The second reason is it pays when the United States wins from global climate action. Secretary Kerry, was recently in Africa, as you may have read. He was before that in Southeast Asia. When we work with these countries to lower their emissions, urge them to raise their ambition, if they use American technologies and we export and Americans prosper as a result, it helps us to build the durable political case at home for why climate action at home and abroad is so important. It's not just for the climate, it's also the case that Americans will prosper as a result. And the third reason is actually something, Rob, I think you've written about, a virtuous competitive cycle. The United States now is demonstrating that we're in this, not just, as Secretary Granholm said, bringing a knife to a gunfight. Even though we aren't the biggest producers of solar panels, wind turbines, and batteries, that's China, we are now coming prepared with our policy suite. We spark a virtuous competition with our allies and with our adversaries, with our competitors. And that's only good for the climate. That means everybody is trying to bring guns to gunfights. And I hate the analogy, but let me say, when we all compete to make the best climate products, the climate's the one that benefits.
Is there a way, is there a way to keep the guns in the gunfight purely metaphorical? Like, should we be thinking about, one thing that I think a lot of folks got into fighting climate change because it's such a threat to international security. And now it's turned out the most effective way to fight climate change is through, and the way that works in the US and the way that it does seem fits into a number of policy and strategy agendas that make sense, is this kind of broader competition with China, with authoritarian states that Josh was mentioning. Is there a way to constrain that competition to just like the civil sphere, so to speak, to just the civil economy?
Look, I think the critical thing to recognize, Rob, is that this isn't necessarily zero-sum. There isn't some fixed market that we're going to all go compete for, and our gain is their loss. What I think we are doing here with this act, with domestic policies that we are encouraging other countries to take all over the world, is broadening the overall pie. One of the headline results from this study that we've heard a couple times now is, look, today we have roughly $250 billion of exports in unabated fossil fuels and their products. That's oil and gas, that's internal combustion engine vehicles. And you heard from the report that the preliminary estimate is $330 billion of potential exports of clean technology products. In a sense, you can imagine the United States shifting its economy to becoming a clean technology export powerhouse. But at the same time, that will still be just a share of the global market, and that global market will be an order of magnitude greater. And so recognizing that as we pass policies like the IRA, and we encourage other countries to pass those policies, we will expand this global market to the point where this virtuous competition need not be zero-sum. We all have a stake in benefiting from the transition to a global clean energy economy.
And I would just add one thing to this. I think when we started this study, one of my fears is that for some of this, we would see like, well, the way to win is to get into a subsidy war, and we're probably not going to win that. What we actually saw is that, to some of the points Ellen was making earlier, the way that we can actually win here, the way America wins, is through innovation, R&D, making things better and cheaper. And because that is the basis of that durable competitive advantage, that is only beneficial for the world. That's a race to the top. A race to the bottom is if we're trying to all out subsidy others and help our domestic. This is a different way of thinking about it that I actually think is far more beneficial for the world.
Yeah, I want to pick up on that too, because what we learned in terms of these kind of the old way of doing things was, okay, let's support the R&D and the innovation, but then we forget about what the next step is. And the beauty of this study is it looks at the next step. So we're going down the value chain, and we've done our R&D and innovation. Now, what do we need to do to make sure it can accelerate and grow so that we don't end up in that classic valley of death? And we know how that story ends. So I think that if you look at the study and you look at that detail across these different stages of development, we want these clean techs to reach that takeoff stage. And so we've identified in the study not only, how can you tackle that, but then how can we make sure that it is durable? And I just want to keep coming back to that point about durability, because we can't have a one and done kind of approach to this.
Well, and it is both durable and diversified. That was the big message I took from this, right? Which is that we, yes, have, for all the reasons that Ellen and others have talked about, an opportunity to have durable competitive advantage relative to the other nations around the world. But we also have, when you look at just the value chain segments across these 6 technologies, and it is only 6 technologies, there's so many more out there that hopefully have this same story with it. The diversification that can happen across this country, and for companies like the few that were on this panel just before us, who can spring up and decide that, yes, that's the lane I want to own, that's the lane I want to drive, and that I can take that to markets both domestically and internationally. It's both the durability and the diversification that I think it shows great promise here.
Excellent. So I want to get into some of these aspects of the value chain. So one thing that we were talking about at the very beginning was that the U.S. does not have the raw materials, or does not always have the raw materials that it sometimes needs. How can we develop a durable competitive advantage? How can I hope to develop a durable competitive advantage without just the raw, let's say even mining capacity, much less the reserves themselves? But how can it hope to develop that advantage if it doesn't have the mining capacity today?
Sure, go ahead, Ellen.
No, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, there are 2 things that I'm sure Ellen's got a great example on one of these. So I'd say 1 is innovation, and 2 is trade. And one of the comments the previous panel made was around friendshoring, right? Mm-hmm. And so is thinking about your supply chain. Yes, what we can do domestically, obviously, that is very beneficial for the United States. It gives us resiliency in our supply chain. But we also have to think about which of our allies we can partner with here, right? So we may not have uranium for the SMR nuclear, but can we partner with Australia for some of this? And then on the innovation point, it's also, are there technologies that we can continue to develop actually to focus more on materials that are more readily available? And Ellen, I know you've got a good example on this one from the auto industry.
Yeah, I mean, you've hit both of the points I wanted to make, but can I add one more, which is patient capital? So, I think as the Secretary pointed out, these, mines and processing facilities, it takes a long period of time to develop that capability. So we need to make sure our capital markets are patient and they're in, so that they have the incentive to invest over the entire cycle, which could be 5 to 10 years for some of these mines. And so I do think the financial sector has a really important role to play in this.
Does the policy exist to support that patient capital today? Because I think one background here is that interest rates are only going higher in the short term, and so it's a lot to ask a financial sector when interest rates are going higher and higher to put that patient capital forward that they were not even willing to put forward in the 20 teens. So does policy exist to help that patient capital today, or is that going to require more policy?
Well, UN Climate Envoy Mark Carney, who many of you may know was also the Bank of England governor for many years, really started the whole process of central banks looking at climate risk and climate risk assessment. He recently said at a conference that about 40% of global financial assets, or about $130 trillion, are really positioned to assist toward the U.S. goal of getting emissions down by about 50% toward the end of the decade. That was a very powerful statement, and it really says to me that the capital markets have already begun to transition, and they're looking for these types of investments that are not just about the next quarter or the next year. Rob, I can't say definitively that the Securities and Exchange Commission or a regulatory environment is positioned on that, but I do think investors are beginning to look longer run.
I also think investors are watching, again, back to my word about diversification, are watching what the public sector is doing in terms of not bringing just one type of money to this game, right? So it is both patient and it's an increasingly diversified set of types of capital that are being brought to this challenge. And so, often the story has been about venture capital and what that is doing to seed startups. That is great, and there's a lot of that happening. There's more and more equity capital going in, and more patient kind of low return concessional capital going in, paired with what comes out of many of these bills, which is guarantees and public grants, essentially subsidies from the public sector. That blend of financing just wasn't on the table, frankly, right? 5 or 10 years ago.
The friendshoring point, Varun, is State Department starting to think about how to work with allies in this building a cross-national kind of green industrial base project that it sounds like we're hinting at, but has not yet fully joined, let's say, American Grand Strategy?
Look, we're not starting to think about it. This has been a thought since day one. It's been a priority for us to build supply chains with friends and partners that we trust. Since day one, our National Security Council, our State Department, our many organs of government have worked on this through a range of initiatives. We have the President's PGII, we have the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, and the simple point is there is no alternative to doing this. Look, with the extraordinary scale of the clean energy deployment we will do at home, a good deal of it we'll be able to produce at home. But we will also depend intensely on our allies, for example, the expertise in Europe on offshore wind, let's say. We'll need to work with our friends and allies across the value chain. You mentioned minerals, sourcing, all the way downstream in order to meet our ambitious clean energy targets. And that's going to be true, by the way, for every single country around the world. Which is why when you see a country raise a trade barrier to the free flow of clean energy goods, we often will work with those countries to make it easier and cheaper to deploy those clean energy technologies and open their market to American goods. That we now think our technologies will be more advanced and superior and able to meet their climate needs.
Does that require more? Can that happen through informal mechanisms, or will that require eventually trade deals, do you think?
Look, I think in all manner of tools are on the table, but I think we've made a lot of good progress with our friends and partners in the Indo-Pacific region, for example. I think many of our friends and partners share this. You'll see, Secretary Granholm mentioned next week in Pittsburgh we'll hold the Global Clean Energy Action Forum, and many of our partners across the clean energy ministerial and mission innovation groups will all be together talking about exactly this, setting up these supply chains in the future in ways that we can really trust the resilience of these supply chains. So I think we've already made a lot of progress through many channels.
We're going to go to questions in a moment, so start thinking of your questions. I will remind you of this right before we go to questions, but a question is a single sentence that ends with a question mark. Mike, one statistic that has been repeated a lot, that's repeated in this study, is that it will take 100 to 150 trillion, I believe, to decarbonize the global economy. What policy do we still need to get there? What policy do we still need to unlock the tens of trillions or hundreds of trillions of dollars that have yet to, that aren't yet turned on, that aren't yet here with the policies that we have?
I don't know that we need more tools. We probably need more of it in the lanes that we've done, right? These last 3 bills have done a substantial amount, as you heard from the CEOs of the 2 companies that were on this earlier panel. That is unlocking this capital on their side in a way that wasn't there before. The idea that you have infrastructure money that can allow them to demonstrate and scale those technologies at a lower risk and with a higher return is a huge, huge move. You need tax credits, to Ellen's point, in a durable way that are 10-year credits that incentivize the reduction of these costs through learning and scaling in a way that allows us to get to the numbers you're talking about. And you need, as Eric, I think, said earlier on the point, you need permitting and kind of the building of these things. This country has not had a great track record, frankly, of putting the type of capital behind building this large CapEx infrastructure in the way that we need to. So I think these bills do that in a variety of lanes that are important, both for emerging technologies and for existing mature technologies. There are many more policies, both from a regulatory and administrative perspective and from a public funding perspective, that will be needed on the industrial sector, for example, in transmission, in those enabling infrastructures, that will allow us to get to the numbers you're talking about.
Tina, what did you walk away from the study thinking we need more of policy-wise?
So, there's a few things that I think we still need to do, but I actually do want to emphasize the permitting point. And you'll see in the study, like, one of the things that underpins so many of our technologies that in order to be successful is relatively inexpensive renewable energy, right? You need it for green hydrogen, you need it for direct air capture, you need it for clean steel. And it still takes too long in this country to build that and build transmission for it and all of this. And so I'd say that's one that it is such a critical enabler for so many of these technologies. That's one I would focus on pretty heavily quickly.
Well, I was just going to add, unlocking potential of the capital and the financing, but also the people and the workers. We absolutely, if we're going to execute on this, we have to make sure that we're giving and finding the full potential of our workforce. And I think Roxanne hit some really critical points. Sometimes they are not emphasized enough. Right now, we've got a labor shortage in the U.S. We have a lot of students coming up through the ranks that have to have an opportunity to reach their full potential. And we know how to do that here in the U.S. better than any other country. We just have to start putting those programs in place to make sure that our workforce, our labor force, can reach that goal and be part of this clean energy transition.
To put a finer point on it, we do know how to do this, and America is successful in so many areas. We do have cautionary tales as well. Look, historically in clean energy, we have followed this innovate here, produce there model. And I want to hammer down or foot stomp what Mike said, hammer down is probably the wrong thing, about emerging technologies. We have an opportunity now in a series of emerging technologies to learn from the past, to say, what can we do differently to ensure that not only do the innovations come from within our borders, but also for the production to happen here and then the exports to come from here.
And what are the emerging technologies? Can you give us are they the ones in the report, or are they
the
other
study
ones?
studied
Great.
6 of them, and by the way, I'm proud to say that the State Department, I'll fund a new phase, a follow-up phase, studying additional technologies. But the 6 here are a good place to start. Next generation hydrogen, advanced nuclear, clean steel, et cetera. These are all areas where not only can we innovate at home, but we can create the market incentives for domestic producers to deploy at home and be competitive. And then we can use our own export promotion and trade policies to ensure that we have market access elsewhere, and that when we go and do diplomacy with other countries around the world, they see it to their benefit to use American technologies. There's a whole suite of actions we've got to take now to capitalize on the opportunity in this study and make sure that we don't do what we did before in the innovate here, produce there model.
Let's go to questions. I think, well, while we start dispatching runners, I will just ask another question because I have so many. Oh,
Got his hand up and he's going to grab a mic.
Hi, Michael Tubman with Lucid Motors. I wanted to know if your report touches on energy efficiency and how that can help us reduce the amount of permitting we need, the critical materials we need, the amount of electricity and energy we need to drive farther, to produce more, and create the types of change you're talking about.
So energy efficiency as a whole, we didn't touch in this particular report. And there are many technologies like energy efficiency, heat pumps, and so on that I think we were itching to get at, but for purposes of time, we focused on 6. I think in terms of how it relates to like electric vehicles, it's an important component of how we think about innovation. Like people have asked us about recycling too, right? Think about recycling and efficiency innovation. That does play a role, but it wasn't the focus of the study.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Nekabari Goka. I work as a principal for policy and corporate strategy at Exelon Utilities. And so in addition to, I'm assuming, permitting, I guess I'm very interested in the study's take on what the preferred role of the utilities should be in aiding the transition here.
It's a great question. So one of the areas that, just as an example, we were focused on was less on the role of the utility, but more how utilities and others are impacted by some of these choices. Like, let's take long duration energy storage, for example. One of the ways that that gets deployed at scale is how you are compensated for that asset in the market, right? And so part of our view was, utilities and others will actually deploy these assets if there are changes made to, say, FERC rules around how we actually compensate and reward for this kind of storage assets. So from that perspective, that was in there, and that was actually a critical enabler for LDES for us in the study. So we recognize that while there's different kinds of incentives, one of the ones that still needs to be put in place are, for example, like market incentives on how we compensate for different assets on the grid.
Yeah, we have 2 great third-way experts that are working on a policy memo around long-duration energy storage, and they'll be, talking a little bit about the carrot and the stick, as you know, NECA, the issue around state mandates, for example. So they're going to really take a hard look at that. So look for that memo to be released over the course of the next several weeks.
I want to actually intervene now and ask a few more. So, how will we know that this strategy is working? How soon will we know? I think this is a Tina question, but I'm actually curious to hear from everyone on the panel. So at what point will we know, hey, these things are actually catching on, these industries are going to get built in a durable, competitive way that will outlast kind of, at least let's say, the lifetime of the initial lifetime of the IRA?
So to start with, I think, many of these technologies that we see, and you'll see in the paper, they don't get big for a while. So if we are not thinking and planning for that now, we might actually, you could actually lose the moment because all of that has to be put in place today for what we need 10 to 20 years from now. So I think seeing where the investment flows are going and how quickly those start to deploy, I think is an important marker. The other one I would just flag is that we expect us to be in a supply-constrained environment for these technologies. And so if you are, for example, a corporation and you decide that some of these technologies are important to you in 10 to 15 years, you need to be investing in that and ensuring your supply chain on that now. There isn't actually a lot of time to wait on doing that.
What is a close analog to the scale-up, the physical, CapEx level scale-up that we're about to do? Because it seems like this kind of companies need to be planning their energy needs or their whole energy mix needs 10 to 15 years in advance seems at least like something they're not used to doing.
It's a different capital planning cycle.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's, we've had a lot of discussions with corporations about this too. It's a different way of thinking about capital planning. So there is going to have to be a shift, and it's a different way of thinking about your supply chain. It's not just, you cannot rely that in 10 years, if you want a technology, that it will be available to you, especially given some of the push around Buy American in some of these technologies, right? If you want an American supplier for this, for like one of these technologies, you should be investing in those suppliers now to ensure your supply chain in 10 to 15 years.
Do companies understand that? Like, are executives understanding that they need to start thinking about these questions of supply on a 10 to 15 year basis?
Well, some do. And I mean, Varun and I, one of the things that we also work on is the First Movers Coalition, right? And that's one of the topics that has come up a number of times there around like, yes, I am making these commitments years in advance because I do have to. It's not all, but some are definitely thinking about it.
I mean, let me just double down on what Tina said. Seifi Ghassemi earlier said, we've got the IRA, it's going to support the investments in the supply of these technologies. What we really need now is the demand. We want to make sure that the fertilizer plant, the cement plant, the steel plant, they're all buying in fertilizer and steel, they're buying the hydrogen that we can now produce at cost parity. That's what the First Movers Coalition is doing. And Tina's been instrumental, Mike, so have you, in setting it up, where now Ford Motor Company says 10% of my steel will be near zero carbon by 2030, according to our extremely stringent definition. And they're doing it partially because it's the most effective climate impact they can have, and partially because in 2030 there will be a gold rush, I'm mixing my metaphors, for near zero carbon steel. And they're going to be first in line because they've already gotten the offtake contracts all lined up. So that's very briefly. To your question on how will we know we are successful? It's kind of an easy answer and a hard answer. The easy answer is, you can measure it in 2030. What is American companies' share of domestic deployment and American companies' share of exports today? Vastly more than 90% of our exports in energy are in dirty energy. Will that ratio shift? But there's something more subtle that I think we should monitor, which is, you mentioned, Rob, your interest in durable competitive advantage, and Ellen answered the question with, America has durable competitive advantage because we are innovative leaders. We have a university system that is unparalleled, right? If American companies are at the forefront of developing the next generation of technologies in each of these fields, if we, for example, lead the world in patenting rates in these fields, if the technology generations that come out lead the rest of the world, then we probably have a good sense that even as we win market share, we're also setting ourselves up to win in the next decade beyond that. Because competitive advantage, as you said, I think, is capricious. You may win in 1 year, and the next year somebody else undercuts you on cost. And the only way you build that moat is through technology and innovation.
Yeah, completely. I was just going to triple down.
No, please.
I think how you know is a little bit of what Tina said, capital flows, right? That's one obvious indicator. Varun just highlighted the kind of innovation ecosystem that is unique and kind of unparalleled in this country that drives and invests in that future. And if that looks as steady as it does now and it continues to grow and is robust, great. That's a really good sign. If it doesn't, that's the thing that we should all be worried about. And then third, to Varun's point about the marrying up of supply and demand, there have obviously been loads of kind of, I don't want to say in theory, but there have been loads of commitments by companies and countries, right, in the last 5 years about getting to net zero. There is some set of folks leading the way there to say not only are we committing to it, but we're signing offtake agreements or purchasing commitments, even though right now that may be more expensive for them. And it's that kind of, what I think is a really important indicator is to see how many people are going from, in theory, commitment to, in practice, purchasing commitment, right? And so if we see more and more of those at the scale we need to get to that trajectory, that's a really good sign.
And we're going to see an announcement, I think in a couple of hours, with Secretary Buttigieg at Cleveland Cliffs facility in Toledo, Ohio, to talk about Buy Clean, that the federal government is going to be procuring clean steel, clean cement, clean asphalt, and clean glass. there's a great result that we're going to point to, because you can't get to that contract for procurement, unless you're in the ball game, that you're producing that clean steel. So I think there are going to be some great markers coming out of that program.
Mike, what's the biggest risk to this very rosy vision of durable competitive advantage and technological diffusion and supply meeting demand that we've been talking about? What's the biggest risk, let's say specifically for America and for the American role in the clean energy industry?
I think it's one of time. I think we don't have to Tina's point, if we want to be competitive, 20, 30 years from now, we need to be making this change now. Mm-hmm. And we need to be both at a public sector level and private sector level, making those commitments and those investments in people and operations and infrastructure now. We have an unprecedented amount of public money now sitting there ready to be spent. We have private money that looks ready to come in on the sides of that. Moving that stuff at a pace together that gets us on that trajectory Tina was talking about is not an uncomplicated task, right? And implementing that, all these great provisions and moving that capital, again, in all directions, requires a real skill and a set of strategies that are aligned. And so that, I think, is a risk. I think if we don't take advantage of this crazy good menu in front of us right now, that's a problem.
It's so funny, we were talking about this right before the session, where I have been covering purely hypothetical climate policy for 6 years, and suddenly there is so much climate policy on the books, both in a legislative and executive sense, that it's far exceeds the ability of one person to even kind of track what's happening. It has become a much more complicated field so quickly because of the addition of all this policy. I want to go down the line and just ask Alan, what do you think is the biggest risk to the U.S. here?
I have a friend here who's working in wind for many, many years, and one of the things that she always points out is how important it is to get community involvement and really pay attention to all the stakeholders, because point of fact, if we're building out a lot of renewables, this is going to be in our communities. And so we've got to make sure that we're out there not just thinking grand about each one of these clean techs, but that we're working really hard to make sure communities see what the benefits are. And clearly, for many of our communities who've been so impacted by the climate crisis, they're ready. They understand why this is important. We just have to make sure that we continue to tell that message, get that message out.
Varun, biggest risk?
Rob, let me first say, you have been one of those voices out there who's been calling it like it is, and I appreciate that. Ahead of the IRA, you were saying, look, let's not blow it. And after the IRA, this is, the biggest deal we could have imagined. So I appreciate that. Biggest risk to...
You got to put the flattery at the front of the panel. You really mistimed it on this one, I have to say. But thank you.
A little more flattery. I'll double down on Mike's point. Biggest risk here is we don't take the opportunity. Look, this is an unprecedented set of incentives for clean energy in this country. And now this administration is focused on making sure that translates into real competitiveness. Look, if all we do is let the incentives lead to increased clean energy deployment, but our companies are not durably better, we probably will have failed in the enterprise. So we have to focus on using the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law dollars, dovetailing them in this troika, as we talked about, with the IRA tax incentives, and making sure that our companies not only get the incentives, but they use them to become technologically superior. And that will take real work.
How can the government do that? Sorry, just can it actually kind of be like, no, you're not being competitive enough, we're going to withhold, I don't know.
Look, this administration is taking a very careful look at what the best way is to spend some of the dollars from the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. Mm-hmm. For example, in the industrial hubs, the hydrogen hubs, making sure that we are investing those dollars in places where there will be state and local action, federal action, and all these incentives put together in a way with our universities and labs so that we can win at home and abroad.
Got it. Tina, we're right at the end, but
right.
Biggest risk?
Yeah, I don't disagree with anything anyone said here. So, but I will add one thing, is that there will be a change in corporate mentality that is required to drive this. And I mean that both from the length of time you look forward in terms of capital planning cycles, the way that you think about your obligations, like from a just energy transition and economic development perspective. And I think also the way that you have to think about your supply chain and ensuring it in a way that they haven't until now. And I think that mindset change is going to take some time, but it's really important.
Excellent. We'll leave it there. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That's great.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome back to the stage, Josh Freed.
Thank you all very much, and thank you for joining us today and for the two wonderful panels. An event like this can't be done without a lot of people who were not on stage to make that happen and make the report happen, which is also live on our website at thirdway.org. So please visit it, read it. It's great afternoon or bedtime reading. Absolutely scintillating. So I wanted to quickly thank people, and then after that, we do have a reception that's just upstairs. From the Third Way team, and it was an entire team effort, and particularly Jared DeWeese and Mary Sagatalova and Sophia Alam and Ryan Fitzpatrick, who led both this event and the report, and Ellen Hughes-Cromwick, who oversaw the report. This would not have happened without them. Our partners at Breakthrough Energy, particularly David Palella and Robin Milliken, and then Karin Mistry and Emma Delrose at BCG. It was an absolute team effort, and we really appreciate all of their work. With that, this event is concluded. We really appreciate you joining us for the whole thing, and if you can take the elevators or the stairs, we are having a reception upstairs if you have the time and want to mingle further. So thank you very much.